Alright guys, so we are back with another NestJS tutorial. So in this tutorial, I want to cover the exception filters section that's part of the NestJS documentation. Essentially, the goal of this series is really just to cover as many things as we can. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about the exceptions layer. So you can see that according to the documentation, and we've actually saw this earlier from one of our previous tutorials, there's actually an exceptions layer, and that layer is actually responsible for handling unhandled exceptions. Okay, so you actually don't even need to worry about handling exceptions yourself. Like, let's say, for example, if a controller throws an error because the user is unauthenticated, you can actually let NestJS handle that for you. So that's one thing that's nice about NestJS, is that it has its own exception layer for you to do everything literally for you. So you don't have to handle. Obviously, you should still handle your own errors accordingly, but you can also let NestJS handle it for yourself. Okay, so we actually took advantage of this layer. If you actually look over here in the customer's controller, we actually threw an HTTP exception, and you saw how when we threw that HTTP exception, we can provide a custom message as well as the status code. Okay, so in one of the episodes where I showed you guys how to set up a GET request with a route parameter, I showed you guys how we can do it the express way, where we can use the request and the response to control what is being sent back. But we also did it the nest way, and that was instead of using the request and the response objects, we can actually just return an actual object itself directly back to the user. And if the object was not found, we can just throw an error, and Nest will handle that for us underneath the hood, and it will return the appropriate response. Okay, so it'll return a 403 if we specify as a 403, or a 400 if we specify as a 400. Now, by default, we have the HTTP exception class, but let's say, for example, if you want to have your own custom exceptions, you can actually extend this HTTP exception class, and you can just throw that class itself instead of having to pass in arguments into the constructor of HTTP exception. So I'll show you guys what I mean by that. So let's go ahead and let's go into the users module. Okay. And what I'll do is let's go inside, let's see, let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go inside user service, and what I'll do is I'm going to add one more property to user, and I'll just add an ID, okay? And we'll just add an ID for all of our users, so let's just do that real quick. Let's see, ID 3, ID 4. All right, and then what we'll do is we'll implement, oh, let me also add that as well to the serialized user. Okay, and what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I will implement a method at the service layer called get by user, or get user by ID. Actually, let me see something real quick. Let me go back to the customer service. I should really be calling this find user by ID. You know, I'll just, since we already have get user already, I'll just stick with get. I'll just stick with get. So get user by ID. We want to be consistent with our naming convention, so it's not good to have like a mix of get and find. Though sometimes they could mean different things, but for now, it just means only one thing for us. Okay, so we're gonna get the user by ID. So all we're gonna do is we're just going to search the array. So we're gonna pass in a predicate that will return true if the IDs match. So if user.id is equal to ID, then it will return this element, this user element from the user array. Okay, so now that we have the user service, let's go into the user's controller, and let's go ahead and implement let's see. So we need to implement a route to search for the ID. So here's what I'm going to do. So right now, this route parameter is username. So I'm actually going to add a username. I'm going to add a username path before this ID. And then I'm going to go ahead and add an ID. I'm going to basically prefix it. Because if I were to, because with route parameters, you can't actually just have it like this, because that would just treat it as the same. So, and I think it would actually call the first function in the class instead. So let's actually separate it. So we'll have /user/id, and then we'll pass in the ID. And then for the username, we'll pass in the username after the username path. Okay, so let's go ahead and do get by ID. Okay, and this will take in a parameter ID, and the ID will be a number, or yeah. And I'll also use the parse int pipe, so we can actually parse this ID from a string, because by default, it's actually going to be a string. Okay, even if we type annotate it, it's really a string. So we'll parse it to an actual number. So that way, if the end user who's calling this API tries to pass in an invalid ID, it will actually validate that for us and return a 400 status code. And you guys saw that in a previous tutorial. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and call this .user service to get user by ID. Oops. And I'll pass in the ID. And what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and first I'll check to see if user will return a serialized user. Because remember in the previous tutorial, or not the previous one, but in one of the tutorials when we talked about serialization, we wanted to exclude the password from being displayed. So if we don't return a serialized user, it'll actually give us the password, and we don't want that. So what we do here is we return a new instance of serialized user, and using class transformer, we can use the exclude decorator to exclude password. And in order to actually get this to work, we also need to use the interceptor. So if you guys are a little bit confused about this, I have a video that talks about serialization. So go ahead and check that one out. It's somewhere in the NestJS playlist. Okay, so for now, I'll just return this serialized user, and let's go ahead and test this out. So let's go to /API/users, username. So that's going to get us the user by username, but you get it by ID. So if I pass in a non-numeric string, it's going to perform validation for us thanks to the pipe, the parse int pipe. You can see that it says numeric string is expected. So I pass in 1, you're going to see that it gives us back the serialized user. If I were to actually just return the user, it's going to give me the user with the password. Okay, so you need to make sure that you don't return passwords, and you also need to make sure you use the interceptor. Okay, now let's say for example if the user is not found right now, it doesn't do anything. Okay, it returns a 200, but it doesn't actually do anything. Okay, it doesn't actually tell us if the user was not found or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our own exceptions. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll create a new folder, and I'll call this exceptions. And what I'll do is I'll create a file called user.not_found.exception.ts, and we're going to create a class that is going to extend the HTTP exception class. Okay, and that's what they recommend in the documentation. So let's go ahead and do that. So export class user.not_found exception extends HTTP exception. So it's good to also suffix your class with exception, just so we can keep track of what it is when we actually throw the error. So we're going to implement the constructor, and we're going to go ahead and just call the superclass. And for the superclass, we're just going to pass in the parameters, the same parameters that we'd pass in for the HTTP exception. We would pass it in for the user not found exception. So for example, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and say message and status. So these are going to be two arguments that we're going to take in from the constructor. So the message is just going to be a string, and the status is going to be of type HTTP status, which is just an enum that's imported from the NestJS common library. So what I can do is I can actually just pass in the message. So if the message is actually defined, then it'll take that value. If it's not defined, we can actually just use the OR symbol, and I can just say user not found. And if the status is present, we can pass in the status, or we can just pass in our own status. Bad request. Or let's do not found. There we go. So this gives us flexibility. So if we want to override the message, we can. If we don't, then we can just have the default message. So let's go ahead and test this out. So let's go ahead and do else throw new user not found exception. Okay, and since we had those arguments in the constructor as optional using the question mark symbol, we don't have to actually pass in anything to a constructor. Let's go ahead and test this out. So let's go ahead and test this out. So you're gonna see that it gives me a 404 user not found. Okay, I think actually it'd probably be better if we used bad requests instead. Let's do that. Okay, so let's hit send, bad request. If the user is found, it's going to give it back. Okay, now let's say if I want to override that message. So let's go ahead and do user was not found. Okay, let's do 33. You can see that it gets overridden. If I want to pass in a custom status code, let's do 500. You can see it gives me 500. Obviously, that's not the correct status code, but I'm just showing you guys how we can get it to work. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and you can literally use your own exceptions. So instead of just having the HTTP exception, because sometimes you might have your own custom exceptions, right? You can handle that accordingly to fit your application's needs. Now, one more thing that I will mention is that there's also a lot of built-in exceptions already, and these are just classes that you can actually just use, and it's all part of the NestJS comment package. So you can see that there's actually a not found exception, so we can actually just use that as well. So not found exception. Okay, now if I go ahead and call the API again, you can see that it gives me the 404 not found. Okay, so you can use any one of these to fit your application's needs, or you can create your own. Either one works, whatever you feel like is best for you. Now, oftentimes you might want to actually handle your exceptions manually yourself, and you don't want to actually let NestJS handle it for you. So what you can do is you can actually use an HTTP exception filter, and what you can do is you can pretty much catch all the exceptions that occur, and you can handle it however you want. Maybe you're not satisfied with how NestJS is handling it, and they have flexibility for you to implement your own. So what we can do is we can actually create a HTTP exception filter, and all we have to do is implement the exception filter interface, okay? And we can actually just connect that with our requests. So if there is an exception that occurs, it'll pretty much apply that filter. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say, for example, for this get by ID function, I want to manually send back a custom response. Maybe I just don't like the format that NestJS is giving us the error back, so we can go ahead and implement our own. So what I'll do is inside the users, inside the users module, I guess what I'll do is I'll create a new folder, and I'll call this exception. Actually, I'll call this filters. Okay, and I'll call this HTTP exception filter. And actually, I'll just call this HTTP exception filter.ts. Okay. And let's go ahead and create a class. And we'll call this HTTP exception filter implements exception filter. And you're going to see that it's going to look very similar to how we have it in the documentation. Okay, so we're implementing this interface, which means that we need to implement the actual methods. So we need to implement that exception filter method, which is the catch method. Okay, this method takes in two parameters. It takes in the exception itself, okay, and it takes in a host, which is the arguments host. Okay, now this arguments host actually allows you to, it's actually like a utility object, and it actually allows you to get a lot of certain properties from it. So for example, if you wanted to get the request and the response object, you can actually directly get that from the arguments host. Okay, but we won't talk much about that right now. Okay, so let's just say, for example, let's go ahead and just console log the exception so we can see what it looks like. And there shouldn't really be much to this to this instance, to this object, but we can get the response, and we can go ahead and get the status as well. And there's a lot of other things that we can actually get from the exception as well, but we'll log it to see. Okay, now if you look at the documentation, they show you an example. They have a nice recipe that shows you how you can actually send back a custom response. So you can actually use the arguments host. You can switch it to HTTP, which will allow you to actually get the request and the response object. So if I do that, let's go ahead and do context equals host and switch to HTTP. Okay, and this will give you back, this will allow you to get the request, response, or even the next middleware function to be called. So I'll just get the request, context, get request, oops, and I'll get the response as well. So context.get response. Okay, so let's go ahead and just send a response back. And the status will just be, let's see what's going on here. Why is, oh, it seems like we need to type annotate this in order to get IntelliSense. All right, let's do that real quick. So for now, what we'll do is we'll just send back a status. So response.send status. And the status that we'll send back is whatever status the exception status is. Okay, now let's actually, integrate our filter with this get by ID function, or this controller function. Okay, so all we got to do is we just got to go ahead and use the use filters decorator and pass in the filter. So we can go ahead and pass in an HTTP exception filter. And let's watch what happens. So when we go ahead and go into Postman and let's click on send, and you're gonna see that it actually gives me not found. So it doesn't give us that JSON anymore. Let me actually show you guys the before and after. So let's just see what it looked like before. So if I remove the filter, if I make a request, you can see that by default, this is how NestJS will send back the message, okay? If I apply the filter, we can control how that response is sent. Now you can see that we are throwing that error over here and it's being caught over here. Now we should actually annotate this with the catch. Okay, so we can just mark this as an actual NestJS filter. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So HTTP exception. Okay, cool. So there we go. So let's go back here, and if I click on send, you're going to see that it just sends back a status, and the status itself seems like it was a 404. Whoops. Seems like it was a 404. Wait, what's going on? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm using not found. Let me go ahead. I'm using the not found exception. That's part of NestJS. Let me go ahead and use the one that I created, the user not found exception. Okay, there we go. So this should give me bad request. Perfect. So this just sends back a direct status. Maybe you want to send even more. So, for example, let's do send, and we'll go ahead and say status is exception.get status, message exception.get response. Okay, and let's just go ahead and send that. There we go. Looks very similar. Let me go ahead and look at the logs and see what is actually being logged. Okay, so you can see that we have, let's see, we have the user not found exception, we have the response, the status, and a bunch of other stuff that's part of the exception. Okay, and let's see, is there anything else that we can get from the exception? We have the init message, the stack. Okay, nothing really really useful for us. Okay, but you can see how we can create our own filter, and we can literally manage our own exceptions. So we can manage the response sent back. Now, if you don't want to, now let's say for example, if you want to handle your own exceptions and you don't want to use exception filters, you can actually just do that in the control level. But here's the thing though, with NestJS, it provides so many different things that it can do for you. So instead of actually putting everything in the controller, you can actually let these different utilities, these different filters, these different middlewares, whatever it is, you can let them handle things accordingly. So when you use something like Express, you might be used to doing everything in just one function call. But with NestJS, it encourages you, it doesn't force you, but it encourages you, at least from the documentation, it encourages you to take these tools that it gives you and use it accordingly. Okay? So instead of, like, for example, instead of handling, like, exceptions using a try catch inside here, because we could technically do that, and I could technically use the request and the response object to control what is, what is happening with the request. But why would I do that when I can just let additional things that NestJS provides for us, like exception filters and or middlewares, right? And let NestJS do all of that for us with these tools. Okay? And it makes it better for us because we can actually separate concerns. So instead of having everything done in just one controller function, we can separate concerns, which means that it makes it easier for us to unit test our application. Okay, so that is practically it with exception filters. Okay, if you guys want more references, you can just go to the documentation and you can see what they have over here. They have many different recipes that you can play around with. Okay, so I suggest you guys go through documentation. Use this video as guidance and go through the documentation and try to configure your own exception filter. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was exceptions, custom exceptions, as well as exception filters. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.